language change. It's my research program in general. But today I'm going to be talking about a specific research project called the Michigan Diaries project. The goal of this project is to document language change during the pandemic. But to begin, I'm going to take a big step back. For anyone who's less familiar with sociolinguistics, the goal of this field is to understand how language is impacted by social factors. So what this means is social factors like age. So how do children speak differently from older folks, and how does that change as they age? Gender, how do people of different genders speak differently? Ethnicity, how does your ethnicity impact how you speak? And also, how do you index these things using language? How do you show solidarity using language? But also less clearly social things like geographic location. How does language differ by, let's say you live in a city versus you live on a farm somewhere, or you live in Michigan versus you live in Kentucky? Also social class, right? So does the job that you do impact the way that you talk? And today, my focus is going to be on how social events might impact language, and specifically how COVID and social distancing initiated by COVID is having an effect on language. So my big research question that drives my entire research program, basically everything I do, is this question of how does pronunciation change from one generation to the next? So it is the case that language is always changing. It's just always changing. And one of the ways that you can tell this is in writings going all the way back to like Old English, you can always find somebody complaining about how kids these days talk. And then those kids these days will grow up to be older folks writing their own grammar books, and they'll complain about how the next generation talks. Right? Language is just always changing. I have here an example, like if you were a baby boomer, you might say that something is cool. If you're a Gen Z, you might say that it's lit, right? Lexical items, vocabulary items like this are a little bit more obvious to speakers. They can choose what words that they use. I study pronunciation because it is much more subtle. A lot of times changes in pronunciation are actually too subtle for speakers to be aware of. But nevertheless, if you look at like 6 generations in a row, you'll see that whatever pronunciation change there has been will continue on in the same direction. So that you might be able to hear a difference between a great-grandparent and their great-grandchild, even if you don't hear a difference between each intervening generation. This makes pronunciation a really good topic for linguistic analysis because speakers aren't really doing intentionally funny things to it most of the time. They're really systematic in how they pronounce words. But to aid in our understanding of pronunciation changes, we can, even though pronunciation might be a little hard to hear with your human ear, we have all these tools at our disposal that can let us actually physically measure pronunciation. So I'm going to play a little sound clip here. It's me saying the word teapot.
Teapot.
Okay, teapot. And here you can see this is just like a normal WAV file that you might see on any recording device. We can do some transformations on this WAV file, specifically a Fourier transformation, to produce what's known as a spectrogram or a voice print. This bottom half of the screen here is actually the exact The thing I want to draw your attention to is these really dark bands. These dark bands represent where energy is focused in your vocal tract. You don't have to know what that means other than it means that we can actually specifically measure how people are pronouncing different sounds. These red dots here are tracking where these dark bands are. And if we start with the word T, we can measure that first band. Those are called formants, or F1. And that first formant in the word T is around 260 hertz. That's the energy at which my E is focused. And the second band is around 2800. We can do the same thing for pot and find that the first formant is at 1000 and the second formant is around 1400. This gives us a physical measurement on things that are a little bit tricky to hear. Now, tea and pot are easy to hear the differences between, but if I produced a pot with a F1 of 10, 10, you would not be able to hear a difference. But this process would be able to pick up a difference. Okay, what we can then do with these measurements is plot them along a vowel chart. We've reversed the axes, and the reason that we reverse the axes is that it ends up matching up with where your tongue goes, your articulators go when you're pronouncing these sounds. And if we're going to plot these words that I just pronounced, tea and pot, tea would be way up in the top corner of my mouth, E, and pot would be at the very bottom, pot, around there. We can plot all of my entire vowel space. This is not my actual vowel space. This is a dummy example. And I've just shown you what it's like to measure 2 vowels. Now, because of computers, it allows us to measure several thousand vowels or several thousand words from every single speaker that we listen to. And this allows us to actually track microevolution of language from one generation to the next. Even changes that are actually imperceptible to the human ear, but as I said, reliably pushed forward across generations. Okay, so what about pronunciation changes in Michigan? We are all living in a state that is really robust, actually, for studying language change. Here's a map of the Great Lakes area. And Michigan is actually at the center of what's known as the Northern Cities dialect area. So the Northern Cities dialect area includes Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, and Rochester. I like to tell people it's the Michigan vowel pronunciation because it is centered around Michigan. There is a specific and shared way of pronouncing vowels in this entire region. The pronunciation is more extreme in the bigger cities, and it's a little bit less extreme in smaller towns like Paw Paw and Chelsea or Holland, which is where I'm from originally. But, okay, so we have a lot of research showing what the background of Michigan speech sounds like. But recent work coming out of Michigan State actually has found that a few aspects of this dialect have been really rapidly changing. So research at the MSU Sociolinguistics Lab, which I'm co-director of, prior to me getting here, has been tracking how kids across the state are changing 2 of these iconic pronunciations. So we see this really big generational shift. Now, it is also the case that social interactions are a really important part of language development and language change. And when I say social interactions, actually here I mean physically face-to-face interactions. Sorry, I just got caught up in the chat. So here are a few things that we know about how language development and language change works. The first is that when a dialect is in the process of changing, very, very young children, like 2, 3 years old, they'll acquire whatever their caregiver's linguistic patterns are. So they'll sound basically like their primary caregiver. Then when they enter into a pure cohort, and in the US, this is usually preschool or kindergarten, they'll take whatever their parents gave them, and then they'll get together with their group of friends, their group of peers, and they'll converge on a group mean. And so a lot of parents have this experience of noticing that their kids suddenly start talking differently when they get to kindergarten. Okay, so now they sound a little bit different from their parents, but not all that different. When they become preteens and teenagers, that's when all of the action is happening in language change. They're actively stepping away from their parents' pronunciations. But, and this is what drives large-scale language forward. This is what causes language to kind of track along itself over generations. But, and this is actually a little bit of a surprise to sociolinguists as well, it turns out that this entire process relies on in-person interactions. So TV doesn't actually make that big of a difference. And to everybody's surprise, internet interactions doesn't make that big of a difference in pronunciations. The internet has sped up vocabulary items changing and certain grammatical collocations, but pronunciations just aren't changed by the internet so far. So this drives us to this next question, which is, if social interactions are so important for language change, well, how does the social distancing that has arisen because of COVID-19, how does that impact the changes that we know are happening in Michigan? which brings us to the project. Our goal here is to track, so I've given you a bunch of background on the linguistic side of things, which I am interested in, tracking changes in pronunciation, but we're also interested in the social aspect. So we're a sociolinguistics lab. We're also interested in tracking what are the changes in life experiences during this unprecedented time. And in language use, what I mean by that is like, do people use different words now? Throughout the pandemic, I have here throughout the pandemic and also beyond, because we're also interested in tracking what people's experiences are like as they go back into normal life, right? Like, what is it like to go back and see a movie in a movie theater for the first time? How are we doing this? Well, we are getting in touch with Michigan residents all across the state, and they're sending us audio diaries telling us about their week. In practice, the way that it works is when people sign up for the project, they let us know how often they want to participate, weekly, bi-weekly, or once a month. And then we'll send diary prompts. So we send diarists an email with some prompt ideas. You can see an example here of an email that we sent out. You can see it's got questions about deer hunting season, so early November. Our diary questions always include the first 3 questions. What are you grateful for this week? Has anything been particularly difficult this week? And is there a news headline that has stuck out to you recently? So this allows us to capture a range of experiences that participants are going through, as well as like big social changes like the election or like the flooding in mid-Michigan in May. The rest of the prompts change each week. So we have a big team of research assistants, undergraduate and graduate students who are working with us to generate prompts that are interesting, fresh, and respond to events in the world so that participants have maybe more fun participating. You can see here that we also give a lot of leeway. Some of our participants just don't answer any questions at all. They just talk to us about their week, and that's totally fine. We're interested in what people are going through, and if they don't need our prompts to tell us what they're going through, great, that's great too. We aim to have a range of prompts that ask about things like current events, mundane things. As like a sociolinguist, we're really interested in the things that people think of as mundane, right? Like, what are your daily routines? What do you think is not worth talking about? I went on a walk today. But also broader questions about diarist lives, right? So we want to know things like, where did you grow up? What games did you used to play outside as a kid? And we can track then how things like childhood games have changed over time. And we have actually we generate 3 different types of prompts because our age range for participants ranges from 3 years old to, I think, 107. And you can see that there's a wide range of experiences that might be worth tapping into there. So we create different questions for kids ages 3 to 12, teens ages 13 to 18, and then adults over 18. We have an app. We were super lucky to get connected with, actually there's a class at Michigan State that teaches iOS app design. And we got connected with them early on in the project, and they designed this app for us that now is up in the App Store and on Android. So you can just, diarists can record themselves on their phone or on their tablet and send in their recordings. We have a compensation system where if a diarist has submitted 15 minutes of audio in a given 2-week period, so it's not that much time, but it's greatly valuable to us, we send them a $5 gift card as a way to say thank you. Diarists can also, when people sign up, they can choose to also pay it forward if they would prefer not to receive a gift card. Either way is fine with us, and we're just grateful to have data and participants. Each week, the project selects 2 to 3 anonymized stories from each age group to share on our website. This is another choice that participants make when they sign up for the project, is either yes or no, I feel comfortable having an anonymized version of my stories shared on the website. And I'm gonna actually, so here's a screenshot of our website. I'm gonna leave PowerPoint here because I'm going to share some of the diary entries from our website. I think one of the beautiful aspects of this project is it's enabled us to create an archive of the pandemic, a few stories each week, to hear what people across the state are going through. And I'm going to let participants tell you about their own lives in their own voices. This first entry is from early on in the pandemic, the week of May 17th. So here we go.
It's May 16, my 62nd birthday today. Today I want to talk about one of the side benefits of maybe not side benefits, but one of the benefits of this pandemic is that it's brought life down to its core, to simpler life. I want to talk about the simpler life. First of all, I want to talk about entertaining. So last night for my birthday, and two of my friends who had a birthday this week, I had them over, and we entertained by having a fire in our backyard in this little portable fire pit. We have had this fire pit for a couple of years, and we've used it more this year than we ever have before. Before, it never seemed good enough to have people over just to sit around that fire. It seemed like I'd have to have an event. I'd have to orchestrate more. But it was so simple and so good last night. These two couples came over. They brought their own chairs. They brought their own beer. We sat around 6 feet apart around that fire, and we just had good conversation and watched the fire. And then the sun went down and they went home, and it was just a lovely evening.
So that was back in May. I'm going to next play one of our kid submissions from the middle of the summer, from June. And this is one of my personally favorite entries. I think you will see why very quickly. Oops.
I think that one of the things that I was thinking about that kind of relates to being at home is that if you think about some Disney princesses like Rapunzel and Elsa and Anna, I really like those Disney princesses, and those Disney princesses had to stay home, for example, because they had to stay home, and Rapunzel was locked in a room for a while. But if there's a song in the movie Tangled, which is "When Will My Life Begin?" and it says all the things she did that day. I think that's a really big inspiration, because if you think about it, there's a lot of things that you can do even at home, and if she could get by, I bet we can too. And nonetheless, yes, it can be very boring, but I really think that that's a good inspirational song, even if it was made way before any of this happened. It kind of relates.
It kind of relates. On a personal note, so I and a group of students listen through diary submissions every week and come up with, of the submissions who people feel comfortable sharing, we come up with a representative sample. And the kids' submissions are always so uplifting to listen to and kind of takes us out of our own head. So it's kind of a unexpected benefit of working on a research project like this is getting to feel the sense of connection with diarists. And then the last one that I'll play is from actually one of our team members who is a university student at Michigan State, who is talking about a makeshift ornament tree. I mean, I'm only going to play the first half because this is a little bit of a longer clip.
My parents decided this year that their Christmas tree that they usually have in their house, because we usually do a fake tree, it was too big, so they decided to buy a new one. I don't know if it was an upgrade or a downgrade, but transition to a skinnier tree. So they asked all my siblings and I if we'd like the Christmas tree, and all of them passed, but I responded enthusiastically, like, yeah, I want the Christmas tree. but I have like 2 ornaments, and so I go home and I get this Christmas tree and bring it to my house, and we set it up, and then we get into a decorating spirit, and my roommates and I just start grabbing everything in the house that could possibly go on the tree, whether it's got a string attached, or there's a hole that you can fit a branch through, or maybe it's light enough it can just set on the tree, or because it's a fake tree, it's wiry, we bent the branches around to hold things. So we've got some really awesome makeshift ornaments, like we put some of our kitchen utensils, like a pie cutter, or we have some sewing scissors, and yeah, we have random pamphlets we've gotten in the mail. Just anything we could find is on the tree.
You can see here for this submission, she submitted an actual photo of her actual tree. So you can check it out. And if you look closely, you can see there's a lot of there's like a bottle opener, there's a can of ramen down there. But if you step back, it actually looks like a lovely celebratory Christmas tree. Okay, I'm going to, I lost the ability to switch sharing. Haha, okay, back to the presentation. Okay. So we select 2 to 3 anonymized stories from each age group to share on the website. And our goals here are twofold. One, we want to create an archive of life in Michigan during the pandemic. So you can go to the website and scroll down and just see what people have been going through. But 2, we really wanted to build this project into a sense of community. One thing that we were finding as researchers was isolation is hard. And we hoped that having selected stories so that participants could hear from each other would help build a feeling of community, even though people don't know each other. And what we find actually is a lot of our diarists will listen through the selected stories and respond to them. And over the summer, we had quite a few wedding stories. And we had a couple people ask, oh, how do we send congratulation notes to people? So I think it's been a really nice way of kind of an impromptu community building exercise. And then the last point here is we actually also have a partnership with the Library of Michigan, who has an ongoing COVID-19 corpus that they're collecting stories from across the state. So when diarists sign up, they can also choose whether or not they want to be part of this Library of Michigan initiative. And at the end of our project, we're going to submit anonymized versions of diarists' responses, those who agree, with the Library of Michigan, so that it's a bigger corpus available to the wider public as well. Okay, this is a lot of work, getting a project up and running that allows us to process audio data and do selected stories and send out diary prompts, and coming up with diary prompts. It takes a lot of brain power. So here I have pictures of our entire student team. Five students are grayed out because they were working with us over the summer, and then they graduated, so now they're doing other things. This giant group of students is why we're able to do this entire project. Some students have specific roles in the projects like transcription or story selection. But the biggest thing, the most important thing that we do is once a week we get together and come up with the diary prompts. And this takes about an hour for all of us to get together we split up into separate groups and come up with diary prompts. And the reason it takes so much time is that we want to ask questions that trigger stories in people's lives. So the process is complex. We come to the group together, and some of us will tell, okay, this thing happened to me this week. I got my tire popped, I got stranded. Okay, how can we turn that into a story narrative? Have you ever had car trouble? That one's a little bit easier. We also will take things like headlines or topic ideas that diarists in the week prior have come to us with and turn those into narrative prompts for the next week. One of my favorite diary questions that we got actually from one of our 8-year-old participants was, what's your favorite photograph of you and someone else? What were you doing in it? And that got us a lot of really good answers, a lot of stories. Okay, so here are big picture again, some research questions that we think that we'll be able to answer with this corpus that we're building are questions about the linguistic, like, is it true that the Northern City shift is actually receding across Michigan? This data collection project allows us to collect data from people from a wider range of areas, so we can see if this hypothesis holds up beyond just Lansing. We can also ask specific questions about how adults participate in sound change. Specifically, is it the case that interacting with teens is what facilitates adult participation in sound change, which is something that's been hypothesized broadly, but has been really quite impossible to test because interaction with teens is often correlated with things like your personal disposition. Maybe you chose this job because you have a different orientation towards change. But the pandemic has resulted in, high school teachers, elementary school teachers, middle school teachers suddenly no longer being able to interact face-to-face with teens and younger folks. So we can actually test this question of, is it the in-person interactions that's allowing adults to participate in sound change? And we can also ask specific questions about the trajectory of sound change for preteens and teens. So does isolation from the peer cohort delay preteen participation in sound change? And then, wrong direction. Lastly, and this is less of a linguistic research question and just a broader social interest question, is just how has life been changing for Michiganders? What are people going through? This is interesting to me on a human perspective, but also going back to the sociolinguistic, a lot of these linguistic patterns that we find are directly connected to the way that life has been changing. So in order to understand changes to the language, we really have to understand changes to the social environment as well. Okay, so this brings me to the last part here, which is who is part of the project so far. This is about to be a graph showing different reported ethnicities. When people sign up, they can type in their ethnicity or leave it blank if they want to. And 3 genders, female, male, and folks who have identified themselves as non-binary. And then for us, one of the most important aspects is date of birth. This is along the x-axis. So you can see here, this plot shows all of our participants by date of birth. You can see that our data skews relatively white, but it also skews very millennial. We have a lot of millennial participants, which is great, but is not the entire range of experiences. Our male data kind of imitates the female. You can see our data also skews female. And non-binary folks are majority millennial white. So you can see here, I've drawn a line at 1960. We are really missing stories from Michiganders who were born before 1960. This is a problem for our data set because we want to hear from people from the entire range of dates of birth. What has this year been like? So we've heard a lot of stories from college students, from young professionals, from young parents, from middle-aged parents. But for older folks, what has this year been like? We're not hearing as much of those stories. How have holidays been? What has it been like connecting with family and friends? We got a diary entry last week that was from a middle schooler talking about how the pandemic has, she has more regular contact with her grandmother because she has to help her grandmother with technology regularly. And I thought that's just such a good, it's a human connection piece, but it's also specific to this moment. So I loved that. But also are people coming up with new hobbies? You're in isolation. I've tried personally a couple of new hobbies that have not stuck. I tried baking bread. I am not good at it. But what are the new hobbies that people are doing? Which brings me to the very last point, which is we are still recruiting. We would love to hear from anyone here or we'd be super happy for you to share our project with your friends and family. We would love to hear from you. I'm gonna stop there. I've got some bonus slides in case the conversation goes that direction. We can talk in the Q&A about how to become a participant, and or we can send a follow-up email with more information as well. I'm gonna try to stop sharing again. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Sneller. That was a very good presentation. I sincerely enjoyed it. Well,
Yeah.
now we can begin the Q&A session. So if anyone has a question that they want to start us off with. All right, then I'll get the ball rolling. So Dr. Sneller, what do you think has been the most significant or even most pronounced, sociolinguistic change in the past century or in the United States? What has been what's been the biggest deal, I guess?
Okay, wow, that was a bigger scope than I was expecting, and it's a really interesting question. Okay. The other big kind of cataclysmic event that we know of that had a really big impact on the way that people talk was World War II. We see a lot of changes pivoting in the same direction after World War II. And what we think happened is that young guys from across the country were brought together in, army camps, sent away. Now they're together. Now they form their own peer cohort, and they coalesce in a particular way. And specifically, the thing that has really happened after World War II is before World War II, if you take a listen to old-timey actors, they pronounce their R's, their post-vocalic R's, their R's at the end of a word, less in movies than when they're just actually having a conversation. So they're more likely to say ca and hod, things like that, instead of car and hard. And the fact that there's a difference in that direction, that they pronounce their R's less when they're acting, shows you that there's this prestige to R-lessness. That flips after World War II. After World War II, actors started doing more R in movies than they would in real life. And so what this shows us is that there was a big shift in the social evaluation of pronouncing your R's, that it went from being prestigious to not pronounce your R's to after World War II, it became prestigious to pronounce your R's. So we think, to the best of our understanding, given the data that we have, this was a result of American guys coming together, forming a peer cohort, going over to England, encountering a us versus you experience. The thing that differentiates Americans from Brits are we pronounce our R's, and then bringing them back into that idea back into their home communities. There are other things that are kind of more localized. We think the pandemic will have a big effect on dialects all across North America for sure, probably across the world because of the lockdowns. But there have been similar kind of cataclysmic events. Hurricane Katrina, for instance, resulted in really big language change because the areas of the city that were the hardest hit then had to be evacuated, and kids were evacuated out of New Orleans for 5 to 10 years. So they did their entire middle school, high school in completely different states. And now they're migrating back to New Orleans, and Katie Carmichael, who's a professor at Virginia Tech, has shown that the dialect of New Orleans has really pivoted on the heels of that big population change. I think we have some.
Thank you. That was a hard question. Your way. I'm sorry about that.
No, it was a great question.
So there's a question in the chat box from Tess. There's also a similar kind of follow-up from Marion. And so Tess asked, for your recruiting, do you screen for Michigan born and bred people versus people that have immigrated to Michigan from out of state? And do you also screen for first and second language speakers? And Marion kind of followed up by asking, are you wanting specifically native Michiganders born before 1960, or like in transplanted folk, as she puts it, participate?
Yeah, that is a great question, and the answer is we want everybody. So our participant requirement is just living in Michigan. So regardless of how long you were living in Michigan, when people sign up, we ask for a little bit more demographic information. Where did you grow up versus where do you live now? And that will enable us to, on the back end, some research questions are specific to Michigan. So for those research questions, we'll filter out Michigan natives and analyze those diary entries. But there are a wide range of questions that can be answered from other non-Michigan data as well. Transplants and more recent transplants.
That was a really good question. Bennett asked if you'd be willing to give some examples of pronunciation changes in Michigan that you're aware of.
Yes. So one of these changes is the way that we pronounce short A. So like in cat, my grandparents, my parents say cat. They call my husband Matt, and I say Matt. It's a little bit lower in the vowel space. I actually just overemphasized it. I kind of do something in between those two pronunciations, but that's one of these changes that if you measure it, if you think about that vowel space I showed you, the pronunciation of "a" has been going from really high to incrementally lower and lower and lower. So Gen Z now says like cat.
Has remarked that Dr. Waller could participate in your study, but the one drawback I see with that is Dr. Waller never had anything interesting to say, so I don't see how you participate very effectively.
Wow, that is a sick burn.
I actually, I had a, what was that, Dr. Waller?
You're a brave man, Tyler.
I've moved beyond the class stage of the program. You can't punish me anymore. Yeah. Actually, I had a question. So I noticed on your diagram of like the Michigan dialect area, as you referred to it, that like there's kind of like an arm that's spindled down south into St. Louis, which is where I'm from. But then a lot of my friends at school always make fun of the way I say certain words, like certain phrases I'll use. So I guess my question is, like, how pronounced is the Michigan dialect in St. Louis?
Follow-up question, did you go to a Catholic or a non-Catholic high school?
I went to public school, non-Catholic.
Okay. Catholic schools in St. Louis, in Chicago, in Philadelphia, likely in many other cities, operate as a conservative linguistic force. So your Catholic school compatriots might be more likely to say cat, and I heard that you just said Catholic. Yes, this is what's called the St. Louis corridor. It's this weird little finger of our dialect area that corresponds directly to where Route 66 used to go. Route 66 went from Chicago through St. Louis and then to the rest of the country. And there's actually some really interesting work. Lauren Friedman was studying the St. Louis corridor and found that basically as soon as the interstates were built, that connection between St. Louis and Chicago linguistically started disintegrating, just like the connection via the road started disintegrating. But it happened in kind of waves where there was like the main corridor that followed Route 66. And then there's like two kind of gradations beyond it. So that if you lived on Route 66 proper, you were more likely to maintain the Michigan dialect. And then the people that you were talking to outside of Route 66 were less likely to maintain it. Really good observation.
That's really cool. Judy had a question. She asked, what is the effect of mask wearing in interaction? Are you seeing an effect of that having on linguistics?
Yes. We don't have data on that in our project, but there has been some phonetic research showing that mask wearing has a number of different impacts. One, it increases the likelihood of mishearing somebody, which is expected to increase basically variability in the ether. And as soon as variability increases, language change accelerates. And this, of course, is in direct opposition to what social distancing is expected, the impact of social distancing to have on language. So that'll be interesting to kind of try to tease apart. The place, sorry, I'm going to go back to my acoustic explanations here. It increases misperceptions in consonants. These are the sounds that are in the higher frequency ranges that get messed up a little bit easier. This is one of the reasons I study vowels is they come through really robustly in noisy audio files and in when you have something like a barrier in between. But the short answer is I don't know, other than there's been a phonetic study showing that people mishear each other more.
That was a good question. Thank you. Marta has a question, so I'll let her ask her. Let her ask that.
When you said that there has been a big effect to the language in this year of COVID, can you define more precisely what your expectations are or what you are seeing that big effect to be?
Yes. And I should qualify that and say that we haven't analyzed all the data. So we don't know that the effect has been big. We just expect it to be big. And what we expect really is that, so there have been sound changes that have been kind of progressing at a steady rate for the last 30 to 40 years. And we anticipate that social distancing, at least for a subset of preteen and teen participants, will cause them basically to pause. So that if you look at a graph of language change over 60 years, it'll look like, okay, it's going, it's going, it's going. There's a little blurb, okay, and then it picks up again. So we expect to see this little plateau, which, as I'm saying it out loud, doesn't sound like it's a big effect, but that's the kind of thing that doesn't happen in linguistics. Like once a change is on its way, once it's underway, it's just gonna happen. So that's why I think of it as a big change. It might not sound like that big of a change. Basically that kids will sound like their parents for a generation.
Is that due to their proximity to their parents during this year of COVID?
It's not as, it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's not directly frequency of interaction. We think frequency of interaction matters for adults. For kids, really what we think is happening is they, when they're listening to people around them from a variety of age ranges, what they're doing is subconsciously tracking what people from different age ranges sound like. And then they can extract an age vector from that sampling and predict where they're supposed to go. This is like the big mystery of language change, is that kids always take the next step. How do they know to take the next step? If they're just paying attention to the people around them, they would just sound like the people around them. But instead what happens is they push it forward. There's a couple things we know, for instance, that when there's been some studies done on heritage language speakers, that when kids are taken out of a multi-generational setting, they stop pushing change forward. They sound like their parents and they don't push it forward. Now that gets even more complicated by more ethnographic sociolinguistic work done in middle schools, showing that what we think of as an age vector is also replicated in like high school social cliques. So that, you know, the cool kids, why do they sound cool? They sound cool because they're older. When you're 12 years old, age really matters. When you're 12, being called a crybaby is the worst insult you could possibly imagine. Being thought of as like ready for high school is the best compliment. And so kids of that age in particular are really attuned to age-related things like clothing and like language use. So we think divorcing, and this is also, so we think divorcing kids from this like robust ecology of age vectors is the thing that's going to disrupt their pushing forward language change. It also means that even though a lot of kids are still interacting with like a pandemic pod, or they might be playing like Among Us online with their friends, that's research suggests that that's not enough of a wide range of samples to let them continue on in the normal way. If you're only interacting with 3 or 4 kids, that's not a whole peer cohort. That was a really good question.
That was an excellent question, Marta. Really good response, Dr. Teller. Thank you. Dr. Waller, did you have a question, or did you just type question twice? I couldn't tell.
I do have a question. Thank you, Tyler.
Okay.
Betsy, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. A number of years ago, I read an article by a psychologist called Judith Harris, and she used the fact that children's ways of speaking are absolutely driven by their peer group as evidence for a more general thesis that parenting doesn't really matter, that our aptitudes and our personalities are driven by a combination of genetics and peer group. Now, it may be a slightly unfair question, because for her, language acquisition is an illustration of a bigger argument. But I wondered whether you could comment on the credibility of that broader way of thinking about the significance of how language is acquired or pronunciation is acquired. Does it tell us something bigger about the way in which our nature is fashioned?
That is such a good question. And I'm off on a limb, wildly speculating. But I really think that there is something very strongly to that. We know that all of the linguistic facts that I'm talking about, the vast majority of language change is completely subconscious. People do not know that they're doing it. So it's something that happens unconsciously, and language can't be the only social behavior that's impacted by these peer cohorts in that way. And language, there's a lot of evidence that like it's really strong. Like kids whose parents speak English as an L2 will not only disregard their parents' accents, so they won't speak with an accent, they'll speak with whatever accent their local peers speak with. But also, for a lot of those kids, they're not intentionally disregarding their parents as linguistic models. They'll get to middle school and their friends will meet their parents, and that's when these kids will discover, oh, my parents have an accent, right? So it's like this thing that's happening completely behind the scenes. I'm intrigued by these broader implications, though. I really think it must be the case. I mean, I'm not going to say that parenting doesn't matter, but that's a really nice connection.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to think that the more positive attributes of my children are down to my parenting.
Well, you can continue to think that. That's fine.
Thank you, Betsy.
Excellent question, Dr. Waller. Bennett had a comment about how the map, I'm assuming he means the map about the Michigan dialect kind of overlaps, the book kind of overlaps the area of Yankeedom in the book American Nations. Deb also had a comment. She commented, I guess she was asking you to comment actually on language usage in the UP, Northern Michigan. So like, is there what are the implications, the difference between North and the South of the state?
Yes, so I'm gonna say 2 things here. The first is, that is exactly right. And speaking of like other non-linguistic social things that correlate with linguistics, we see, there's a book called Dialect Geography in the United States Dialect Diversity in America, that I recommend for anyone who's interested in it, that tracks what linguists have long known are different dialect areas. And they correspond really clearly to patterns of settlement, where This area here in this book is referred to as the Puritan area. So folks in this area align in value with Puritan values. So things like paying taxes is good, and other like cultural values. And those cultural values line up also. I don't know if you've heard of the like Where's George study, where some research group took a bunch of $1 bills, wrote a website on it, where'sgeorge.com. And then if you got one of these $1 bills, you could track where this specific dollar bill went. And it showed that these dialect boundaries correspond with cultural differences. They also correspond with where people are not interacting financially. That dollar bill doesn't really cross those boundaries. Yeah, so the Yankeedom comment like really, really fits. And then there's a question about, oh, the UP. Yeah, the biggest reason that the UP is excluded from this dialect area is that there is a dearth of research on the UP. There's very little research. We are starting to collect some diary entries from folks in Keweenaw County. So that's starting to chip away at our understanding of UP speech. And then I know Will Rankinen, who is a professor at Grand Valley, also has a research project where he's tracking the dialect of the UP. It differs from this dialect area in a few ways, but I don't know the specifics of it actually. Tess had a question.
Both of those really good questions. Tess had a question about the project. She asked, is any of the project visible to non-participating members of the public yet?
Yes, so our archive, I'm just gonna put our website here. Our kids, teens, and adults archives for participants who felt comfortable sharing. Those selected stories are available on our website. But that's it. The full database of, so these are just like 1 to 2 minute excerpts. And most diary entries are, I think our average is like 13.5 minutes long. And that full corpus will be available in 2022. It's going to take us some time to go through and get rid of identifying information.
Good question there by Tess. Does anybody else have any questions? Marta, go ahead.
Is there something to a family remaining in the same narrow geographic area for multiple generations? My family's been in Detroit since the 1700s. We can track way back. Wow. And we're still there, and I was born there. And I'm really curious as to whether that has an impact on language.
Yes, via the route of dense social networks. So social network ties, the denser they are, and dense here means if you interact with fewer people but more regularly, that reinforces lots of things, but including linguistic patterns. So communities with really dense social networks are slower to change, and communities with really broad social networks where you might interact with 100 people, but once a week, those are faster to change. There was a really interesting study done in Belfast during the Troubles in the 1980s that showed that, so in Belfast, there was a conflict between Catholics and Protestants, and there were these big walls put up in Belfast to separate communities. And the biggest thing that separated was Catholic men from Protestant men. The women were still going to the town center and working. And what happened was the men were really linguistically conservative. They weren't changing, but the women were continuing on with language change as kind of expected. And the reason is, of course, they were interacting with the same amount of people. They weren't kept out.
Thank you.
That was a great question. You guys, y'all are coming up with such good questions. This is so fun.
Tess just had a comment. She just said she was just making a comment that she thought the project was very cool, both from a standpoint of it's available to public, which is how research should be, and about how for this old medievalist, it studies the great sound. It's really cool. So.
Oh yeah, is that a reference
Does anyone
to
else
for your
have
dialect shift?
anything to add before we go? Dr. Wall's got a question.
Basically, I do have to ask about pronunciation and social class. I remember feeling humiliated meeting an old high school friend once I'd graduated from university, and he pointed out that I didn't used to sound like that. Accent seems to be something less of a signifier, a class signifier in the US than it is in the UK, though there are of course plenty of class signifiers here. Is that true, and where is it or isn't it true?
So what I will say is it's not true from a linguistic standpoint, but this is all qualified, of course, because in places like the UK in particular, social class is much more strict. So people are aware of social class, people are aware of the markers of different social classes, and it's a little bit harder to jump social class than it is in the US. Of course, there are other things in the US that correlate with social class that are hard to cross boundaries. But the upshot is social class is, if you're a linguist and know what to listen for, the way somebody talks really tells you a story about where they came from, and including like if you're from a working class area but went to university. So all of these little social histories from your own personal past get kind of put out in your language production. I have a similar, so my family's from the western side of the state, and my dad gives me crap because I say things like crap, right? Not crap. And the Sneller side of the family, they're farmers. They're like very proud of their like rural identity. And then I went off to the East Coast and went to university there and came back, and it's a big family joke that now I don't say Holland anymore. I say Holland, and it's bad, and I'm bad. I'm not bad. To clarify, no way of speaking is inherently better or worse. It just is.
That's a good question by Dr. Waller. I think Marion has a question. I think that'll probably be the last one before we go, so we'll wrap it up with her. But she, no, we'll let Emily ask her question after this because she got the buzzer. But we'll start with Marion's. Marion asked, why do people fall into different speech patterns when they go back to the places they used to live?
Beautiful. Yes. So this is getting at multidialectalism. So point one is when you're interacting with somebody regularly who speaks differently than you, there's a subconscious accommodation that happens. You might find yourself accidentally kind of replicating certain patterns. Every time I go to the UK, I hear myself like ordering food in the particular prosody, like, can I get a latte? Right? Instead of, can I get a latte? So that's subconscious and very normal. And that it's related to multidialectalism. A lot of folks who have lived for a substantial amount of time in two different dialect areas become fluent in both dialects. And so it's easy for them to just jump back and forth. And in fact, quite hard for them not to. If as soon as you're back surrounded by, especially your first dialect, that's just going to come out because of who you're surrounded by, and because it taps into a variety that you're fluent in.
Excellent question, Marion. So go ahead and let Emily ask your question, and then I think that'll probably be the last one for the day. So Emily, you go ahead.
Hi. So we have been talking about how older folks in Michigan sometimes have these more well, I don't want to describe them with the wrong vocabulary, but they have, different sound than younger people with their vowels. And that was something that I noticed as an out-of-state student at MSU. And I'm sort of wondering how that came about, and then why there's been this shift away from it.
Can you clarify what you mean by how what came about?
The sort of, I guess, this might not be the right vocabulary, but I guess I would describe it as kind of the more pinched or like nasal sort of vowels, like when you were saying how your dad says crap versus you say crap.
Yeah. So the question of how that came about is a really good one, and it kind of connects actually with broader dialectology in North America. Short A is every sociolinguist's like favorite vowel because it's done a ton of work. It's changed a ton over the past century. There are a lot of dialects that are identifiable by the short A pattern. Michigan is one of them, but New York, Philly, Boston, Montreal, and across North America as a whole, Canada and the US, short A has been in the process of being replaced by a like Pan-American short A pattern, where, so for instance, in Michigan, my parents say cat and man, and this is changing to a pattern where people say man, they keep that raised in man, but lower it in cat. So this is exciting to a linguist because this is like a very abstract change that's happening, and it's like spreading like wildfire in the course of, this is really starting with people born after like 1985. So this is really fast in terms of a linguistic change. And it's not super clear, actually. This is an ongoing, there's a bunch of research groups across the US working on that specific question, that cat to cat question. This is one of the vowels that, so you just identified it as sounding pinched or nasal, short A. This is one of the changes that we consider above the level of awareness. So people ascribe labels to either of these sounds. One sounds open and good, or California or something, and the other sounds pinched and Midwestern. And anytime you have a sound that people can ascribe labels to, now suddenly that becomes open to people doing intentional identity work with it, right? So I can go back to my hometown and I can say, Mom, Dad, me and Matt came over, and it's a marker of I'm part of your community, right? There are other sounds that if I change them, my parents just wouldn't notice because it's below the level of awareness. So I guess the short answer is that specific sound has risen to the level of awareness for Michigan, but also really for the entire United States. And so we're seeing really dramatic changes in that vowel specifically.
Really good question, Emily, and really good questions, everyone. That was a really good discussion day. They were really enjoyable. And can everyone just give Dr. Sneller one last round of applause for both her brilliant presentation and her excellent answering of our questions. Thank you, Dr. Sneller.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.
Yeah, Betsy, thanks so much. And Tyler, thank you for your excellent moderating. And thank you all for participating. Just one final word. Next Friday, we're going to be joined by Professor Joe Darden, who is a professor in the geography department and has written a series of superb books on the history of Detroit. So please do join us for that and encourage anybody you know to participate as well. Oh, one quick final thing. We will have a discussion about what day and time might be more appropriate, because I know that Friday at 5 is particularly inappropriate for a large number of people. So we will be sending out a survey, so please indicate any and all times and days which would be more convenient for you. But yeah, thanks again. Lovely to see you, everybody, in the new year. And thanks again, Betsy.